Okay, so I actually just finished recording a piece called A Brief Comment on Theory, where I complained about different sources that discuss and teach about sociology and criminology, uh, boiling all theory down into functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And now I'm about to start a recording on functionalism, one of those three perspectives. But I am doing this because functionalism is going to be, I'm going to use it as a starting point to jump into some other stuff as well. So I'm not presenting this as one of the three sociological or criminological theories. There are a lot of different perspectives. Uh, so I'm going to use this as a jumping off point. It's a framing device. I'm not presenting this as one of the three theories. Okay. So that is why I am doing this. So quick thing, some important figures I want to put out here. You don't need to memorize them or anything, but I should tell you who was behind most of the arguments here. So Durkheim, who we have talked about a lot, and so I'm going to refer to Durkheim quite a bit. A guy named Talcott Parsons and Robert Merton. These are three of the major figures. There's others as well that we'll talk about, but these three had were probably the big. No, they were the biggest influences in the perspective. We need to talk briefly about social institutions before we get to some of the other stuff that I really want to focus on. But a lot of what structural functionalism deals with are social institutions. So we have to figure out what the hell they are. And I have this monster of a definition from Turner. A complex of positions, roles, norms, and values lodged in particular types of social structures and organizing relatively stable patterns of human activity with respect to fundamental problems in producing life-sustaining resources, in reproducing individuals, and in sustaining viable societal structures within a given environment. I'm like out of breath. Just like I feel like I need a rest after that. So that is not a super clear definition, right? If you read that again and again and again, you'll probably be able to pull something out of it, but it is a pretty complex, very wordy. There's a lot of stuff packed into this definition. So I want to try and give just a little bit of hopefully some insight into what this actually means. So we have here a complex of positions, roles, norms, and values, right? So social institutions are a big mix of positions, roles, norms, values. So positions are, I'm an instructor, you're a student, or you're a viewer and I'm a producer. You go into a store, you have a customer and you have a cashier, whatever, right? So we have these positions that people occupy. We have the behaviors that go along with those positions. So that's the roles, the behavioral stuff. We have social rules that we follow on a day-to-day basis. And there are values. Society tells us, all right, this is right, this is wrong, this is a good thing, this is a bad thing, right? So we have just these patterns, these mixes of roles, norms, values, positions that together as a group organize human activity. They organize the way we deal with each other, the way we interact with the world, and they take what could be chaotic, just like a bunch of people just acting all individually, doing whatever random sort of anarchic thing that they're doing, and it takes all of us as individuals, and it kind of standardizes our behavior in a lot of ways, and it makes social life predictable. It makes us predictable, right? So we've actually already talked about this quite a bit, right? When we talked about Durkheim, we talked about the collective consciousness, we've talked about norms and so on, all of these things that really deal with this question of why is social life predictable? We can take all of that and we can shove it all under the umbrella of the idea of social institutions. Well, what specifically does that mean? There's a lot of different social institutions we can talk about. The ones that seem to come up over and over again are, or that are commonly presented as starting off examples, are things like families, right? So we all have a conception in our head about what a family is. Uh, what's important to realize though, so I'm gonna go back. When we talk about social institutions, we are talking about social institutions that exist within a given culture or within a given society. So what a family looks like in one culture is not necessarily what a family is going to look like in another. Actually, these pictures aren't great. I mean, I have people from different cultures and backgrounds here, but fundamentally, conceptions about what a family is can vary pretty widely. So in the contemporary United States, we tend to think about families in terms of nuclear families. So, and we're very heteronormative about this. So we tend to think about a mother and a father, right? That's what I mean by heteronormative. Uh, and kids, right? We don't tend to include the extended family. So, we might include grandparents, maybe aunts and uncles, cousins, but that's about as far as we're going to go. We certainly aren't going to think about family in terms of, well, you live with your parents and grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles, and maybe even more distant family members all together in one, home. Um, we have a specific idea about what a family looks like, and that emerges out of our norms, the positions that we kind of break ourselves into, the values that we have, and so on. But those what family is can vary pretty widely across times and across cultures. Religion is another major social institution. Again, what counts as religion can be, what religions do can vary pretty widely. So in the contemporary, modern world, we find things like Christianity and Islam to be very intelligible, right? They make sense to us. We recognize them as religion and religious practices. But if we were to go back and look at how the ancient Druids went about worshiping, that would seem a bit less, it would make less sense to us. But, that kind of less structured, is it less structured? Actually, that's sort of less structured, sort of not. It's kind of weird. Um, but there, throughout human existence, there have been uh, wide variation in religions and religious practices and beliefs and how formal or informal they are, what they focus on, all these different things. But what's key is that societies are going to have religions baked into them. Now, there might be multiple religions, like in our contemporary US, or you might have societies that are really dominated by one, but there's always going to be a religion or some kind of equivalent to religion within any given society. Again, might be multiple religions, but there's going to be at least one. Uh, doesn't mean everybody believes in it, but it's going to be there, okay, and it's going to have an influence. Other sorts of social institutions, the military or some kind of defense, healthcare, some kind of government, education, lots and lots of different things that all perform very, very different kinds of roles within a given society. So social institutions have a focus. They usually have more than one. So we would have foci, that's the plural. But they all have to do something, right? They all have a task that they are supposed to accomplish, or again, at least one, oftentimes more. So by focus here, we're talking about what is the institution's purpose, what is its contribution, what does it do for that particular society. Family, for instance, if we're going to use the term family in this very broad way, again, covering all the different ways people and societies have used the term, overwhelmingly what families are going to do is they're going to manage or be in charge of reproduction. So that's where the next generation comes from. So in order for societies to continue to exist, we need new members because individual people grow old and they die. And so we need replacements. It's a weird way to think about kids as replacements, but they totally are that. They maintain and continue the society, and they age, they reproduce, have more kids, and then they die, and so on. And so the society is maintained. Regardless of how families are structured or what they look like, reproduction is going to take place within the context of families, and also caring for the young, and not just for the young, and for the older as well, but more of a focus on little kids, but other family members as well. So family, there's always going to be some type of social structure, some type of institution, some type of way in any given society where things like reproduction and care for others is going to appear in one form or another, and we're going to call that the family for that particular society. Religions have foci. They have things that they focus on. They have functions that they are supposed to accomplish. So they do a bunch of things. So one of the major things that religion does is it gives people a way to make sense of reality, make sense of the world that they live in. I know in the contemporary United States and throughout the majority of the world, we don't tend to explain the world in terms of religion. So if somebody gets sick, or if there's a major weather event or something like that, we don't tend to say, okay, God did that. God, I have cancer because God's mad at me, or I have tuberculosis because I am spiritually corrupt, or I'm possessed by demons, or whatever. If there's an earthquake, we don't tend to say we need to appease angry gods. We have science now, so we tend to look to other sorts of sources to explain the way the world worked. But that's relatively new throughout the majority of human existence. People have been around for 150 to 200,000 years or so, and up until a few hundred years ago, really the only way, or not necessarily the only way, but the major way definitely, to make sense of what was happening in the world was to use religion as a way to interpret things. So people still do that now, but it's much less frequent. Religion also provides social rules and moral systems. So it teaches people, this is how you're supposed to act. Religion also provides a way to strengthen and maintain community bonds, which is super important. Actually, with the decline of religion, our sense of community has been eroded along with that as well, and that's a big problem for our societies. We haven't found a way to really duplicate that particular function of this social institution as it's gotten weaker. So those are just a couple examples. So family, religion, again, lots of different things. They, as institutions, are supposed to fulfill functions in our society. So what the hell does that mean? What does it mean to say that something is functional, right? What do we mean by that? Well, we say that a social institution is functional because they exist to maintain and reproduce the society over time. So they exist to have that society continue to exist and to reproduce itself. So reproduce itself in the sense of, reproduce, like have kids, but also just maintain itself over time for it to exist, not just today, but 100 years from now and 100 years after that, and so on. The argument from the functionalists, and this is very different from what we'll see when we talk about conflict theorists, for instance. The argument from the functionalists is that if a social institution isn't functional, as in if it doesn't maintain society, then society would change the institution. Now, that doesn't mean that people would wake up one day and say, hey, the way we are organizing our families or our religion is not great for us. It's not functional anymore, so let's change it. That's not necessarily what would happen. Instead, the society would just gradually over time would have to shift, would have to adapt, would have to change in one way or another. So it's not necessarily something that people would decide like, hey, we're going to do this, but the institution would have to be restructured in one way or another. And if that didn't happen, then the society would fall apart. It would collapse because whatever that institution was supposed to do, it's not doing. So if families fall apart, or the religious system completely falls apart, or the economy falls apart, if it's not fixed, if it's not overhauled, if it's not repaired, then the society can't continue to function. So it will collapse and be replaced by something else. That's what the functionalists are arguing anyway. When we get to the conflict theorists, we'll see that there's there's a lot of disagreement about whether or not this is true. But that's what the functionalists are arguing, that if there's something that doesn't work to maintain society and reproduce society, then it will get replaced or overhauled or changed so that it works. Functionalists oftentimes use the metaphor of the body, so the human body, as a way to kind of get at what they mean when they're talking about things being functional. So every body is made up of different organs, right, that all work together to keep you alive. So you have a brain, you have a heart, you have lungs, you have kidneys, you have a whole bunch of stuff that just is in you that's like doing all kinds of things. I don't know. It's like making blood and doing something with oxygen. I don't know how bodies work. But, we are made up of all this stuff. And you could ask, and I've had conversations with people like this, and I'm sure you have too, where, like, well, what's the most important organ in the body? Well, is it the brain? Because the brain is the thinky part that lets us go out and have conversations with people. And also the brain controls everything else. Yeah, so I guess we could say that's the most important one. But what about the heart? If we take the heart away, there's no oxygen and the brain can't get oxygen, so it can't do its think stuff. Well, maybe the heart. Well, no, what about the lungs? Because the lungs need to do blah, blah, blah. It's a ridiculous question, right? I mean, it's not, I guess it's not, it's kind of like a fun little thing to think about, but in reality, all of the organs are essential, right? A couple on here that aren't. So like the appendix, that's not essential. You can get away without having a gallbladder. But when we're thinking about things like the brain and kidneys and your pancreas, heart, lungs, we need those. So to say that one is the most important is kind of silly because, well, can we say that the brain's more important than the heart? Because if you take the heart away, you die. If you take the brain away, you die. If you take both lungs away, you die, right? So social institutions function in similar ways to society, right? Just like the heart has a function in the body, families have a function in society. Just like the brain has a function in the body, religion has a function in society. So you take away any one of them and the whole thing just falls apart, okay? So that's, yeah, you'll see that as a metaphor quite often. Quick thing I want to point out, because we're going to talk about some examples in a minute, and this can kind of get almost, it kind of get really pretty problematic if I don't clarify something. When the structural functionalists talk about institutions or anything as being functional, they are not saying that the institution or the norm or the value or whatever is functional for individual people. What do I mean by that? Well, for the functionalists, social institutions maintain societies. That's what they do. They organize systems in a way that those systems continue to exist. Whether or not people that exist within those societies are treated fairly, are happy, are kept safe, whatever, that's all irrelevant, all right? Structural functionalists are looking at the ways societies as a whole maintain and reproduce themselves. You can have one society that is allows people to live meaningful lives where they're happy, they can pursue the lives that they want, they have freedom, they have deep connected relationships with other people, they are able to express their humanity and creativity in a safe environment, and they experience kindness and love, and it's all wonderful. And that society can continue to exist over time. But you can have another society that is just as functional, that is incredibly oppressive and is cruel and really doesn't allow the overwhelming majority of people to live lives that aren't miserable and horrible. You can have either one of those systems and have them be equally functional, right? So this isn't about whether or not people within that society are happy. If we're saying something's functional, we're not saying it's good or bad. We're removing the moral judgments from this. Well, from the functionalist perspective, the conflict theorists will say, no, we need to not remove the moral judgment. But when we're talking about functionalists, we are, if we're acting as if we are functionalists, we are saying that, all right, something's functional if it maintains the society, regardless of what it does to individuals. All right. That's what we're talking about. Stability and maintenance and reproduction of societies as a whole. All right. When we talk about functions that institutions have, functionalists have discussed 3 different kinds, and we should go through them. So we have manifest functions, which these definitions are not amazing. Observe consequences of a given pattern and repetitive action that make for the adaptation or adjustment of a given system, which are intended and recognized by participants in the system. That is a rough definition. It makes my soul hurt. And I don't even believe in souls. So that is how rough that definition is. So what does that mean? Well, the manifest function is whatever the institution is supposed to do. Like when we send our kids to school, why are we sending them there? Well, presumably to learn stuff, right? Well, that would be its manifest function. It's the explicit stated, like, this is why we're doing this. We have a healthcare system. We're saying, okay, this is explicitly to try and keep people healthy, to try and keep people, try to maintain people's bodies, right, and minds in a healthy way. That's the manifest function of the healthcare system. It's what the system is intended to do. It's what the institution is specifically set up for. Then we have latent functions. Okay, I'm not even going to read that. You can read it if you want, but it's not great. Latent functions are things that social institutions do that are helpful for the maintenance of societies, helpful for the reproduction of societies, but they're unintended. They're latent. So they're not, when we send our kids off to school, there's a lot of other things happening than just learning stuff. And so those other things, which I'm going to give an example. I'm going to break all this stuff down in a bit with something concrete. There's other things happening that contribute to social stability, that contribute to society continuing to exist. And so anything that happens that we don't intend to happen, but that serves society and does something useful is a latent function. And then we have dysfunctions. So structural functionalists tend to focus on the manifest and latent functions, right? They tend to focus on the things that are keep societies together, that keep societies going, that keep them maintained over time. But they do recognize that there are problems that can emerge within the context of institutions, right? So you can have an institution that overall its existence is functional for society, but that it has dysfunctions. It has things that it does that can affect the system in negative ways that can be harmful. So the broad argument is that these dysfunctions will have to be kind of worked out over time, or they'll destroy the institution. But regardless, we can look at any given social institution and say, okay, well, yeah, here's some bad stuff that's happening. Here's stuff that's that this institution is doing that is potentially damaging to the system as a whole. So I want to give something really specific here. So let's think about the educational system in the United States, right? So the contemporary United States. And what I'm going to say is going to apply to most other places in the world too. But I'm just going to focus on the U.S. for the moment. So the educational system as a whole, or the idea of education as a social institution, okay, regardless of what society we're talking about. Educational systems exist to provide members of societies, especially the young, with the knowledge and skills needed to contribute to the group. Right? So education uh, takes people who don't know how to do stuff, who don't know stuff, and teaches them what they need to know. That can come up in lots of different ways. So when we think about education generally in the contemporary world, we think about things like classrooms and going to college, maybe things like trainings at work, but we think about these formal processes. But go back in time and education. So let's say we're in the year 1200 AD and we're in Europe. Well, education is going to be going out with your family on the farm and being taught how to plow a field or yoke an oxen or whatever farmers did then. I don't know how farming works. I know food is at the grocery store. I don't know how it gets there. But you would just go out in the field with your family and they would teach you what you needed to know. There wouldn't be official teachers. You wouldn't go to a classroom. It would just be, you would be out with the family and they would teach you what you needed to know. If we were tribal hunter-gatherers, you would be, you might be taken on a hunt or taken up to gather when you're younger and you are taught, here's how to track prey. Here's how to build a bow. Here's how to recognize which mushroom isn't poisonous, right? It's not taking place in a classroom. It's family, members of the community teaching you things, but that's education, okay? So, no matter what type of society we're dealing with, the educational system provides members of society with the skills and knowledge they need to be productive members of the group, all right? So if we're thinking about the contemporary United States, right? So our educational system in the US, well, what are the manifest functions? Well, things like teaching reading, math, teaching the kinds of basic skills that people need, that kids need to learn in order to, this is important, in order to function as adults, okay? Specifically, function in the workforce. That's most of what school is at the level of a manifest function. We're training kids so that as they get older, they gain more and more skills so that they can enter the job market and they can function as employees. We oftentimes think of our educations as serving us as individuals. So, I want to study hard and I want to get a degree so that when I go out and get a job, I can make a lot of money and do stuff that I want to do. And we think about it in those kind of individual terms. The structural functionalists, though, are going to think about the implications for the society as a whole, right? So you might be thinking, oh, I'm going to go get this job because I want to, it's something I really enjoy doing, or I want to make money or whatever. But from the perspective of the functionalists, you going and taking that job, you getting trained and going out and getting hired and performing a job means you are contributing to the survival of the system. Okay, you've been trained and you've been taught how to contribute to the group, to the economic functioning of the system as a whole. So by you trying to make money and get a job, all that, you are contributing to the maintenance and the survival of the system. Okay, so that's what education does, manifestly. There are latent functions, though. One of the major ones is teaching conformity. It's teaching people, hey, this is how you act when you're in a group. The educational process is many, many, many years of gradually taking kids who start off as babies who just poop and pee everywhere and just puke everywhere. I have a 13-year-old, and when he was a baby, he just would just poop and pee wherever he was, wherever he felt like, he would just do it. And it was messy and gross because kids are messy and gross. But he goes off to kindergarten. I visited kindergarten classes. They're just kids are bouncing off the walls everywhere, but they're learning the basics of how to, not scream and yell when they're in school. They're learning the basics of self-control. As kids move through the educational system, they gain more and more aspects of, what we call self-control. So for instance, by the time we get to college, You all can sit quietly at desks. You're not screaming, running around. You're certainly not going to the bathroom everywhere like a baby would, hopefully, anyway. Hopefully we can avoid that. But you're learning conformity. You're learning, this is how I'm supposed to act. This is how I suppress my own urges and my own desires, my own feelings at any given moment, so I can act as a member of the group in this social situation. So that's a latent function. Another latent function is the development of social skills. So, we make a lot of our friends, we build a lot of our relationships within the context of schools. We learn how to manage conflict, right? So it's not just about building friendships with people and being nice to them. It's about dealing with things like bullies and people who are mean, and dealing with people who are friends and then who are not friends. Dealing with strangers as you walk through the hallways, right? You're going to be encountering other people, and schools aren't explicitly set up to teach people social dynamics, but just by virtue of the fact that we spend so much time there, they have a massive impact on our development as social beings, right? In terms of how we, learn to manage relationships. Another connected piece is that schools and the school system and the educational system will present people with things like dating opportunities. And so a lot of people end up partnering off with or building families with people they went to school with, whether it be people they went to high school with or college or grad school or whatever. We are brought into contact with people who might become spouses or parents with us or whatever. So there's a function here there's a latent function within the educational system that contributes to the formation of societies as part of our society. And so the education process, by pairing people up, contributes to the formation and maintenance of things like families, right? So that's a latent function of the educational system. And yet another latent function is the passage of moral views about what's right and wrong. So for instance, I have an image here of a bunch of kids saying the Pledge of Allegiance. So a latent function of schools is teaching kids things like nationalism, patriotism, things like sharing and being nice to people potentially, or you have schools that teach people religion, right? Whatever it is. So schools shape our moral views in these subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways. But we're not explicitly saying, all right, I'm sending my kid off to school to be taught, how to judge the world in terms of right and wrong. But that's a big part of what happens. It occurs regardless of whether or not we intend it to or not, right? So it's a latent function. And then dysfunctions. We can think about a bunch of them, right? So there are lots of problems with our educational institutions where conformity to a certain extent is a good thing, right? We tend to hear the word conformity and we tend to think, oh, that's bad. But if people didn't conform, if they didn't follow rules, societies just would collapse. It'd just be chaos all the time, which we wouldn't want. But we don't want conformity to turn into blind obedience to authority. We don't want, well, at least I would argue, anyway, I would see it as a dysfunction if kids were leaving school with this mentality of blindly, or if they've been trained to blindly follow whatever authority figures tell them to do. So there's a real line between, or there's a real, it's difficult to find that line between teaching kids to obey the rules, but without teaching them to blindly do whatever they're told. That's how you end up with like a Holocaust. If we end up in a system where kids are being taught in these really authoritarian ways, then that, I would say anyway, would be dysfunctional, right? At least to the way we want our society to be. Kids through school can get exposed to what we would call maladaptive or deviant behaviors, right? So where you're going to be meeting friends at school, you also can be meeting friends who are teaching you how to do drugs or teaching you how to commit crimes or whatever. So just the exposure to other people who might be doing things that society as a whole considers deviant or wrong or bad or whatever it is, is a dysfunction. So yeah, people make friendships that last a lifetime, that make their lives better and provide support and do all these great things for people in schools. But people also make friends with those who like hook them up with heroin for the first time, which isn't good. Probably. I don't think it's good. So I would say that's bad, or it's dysfunctional anyway. So, that social aspect can cause problems. Also, something that is super troubling, and if you haven't been paying attention, well, first of all, where have you been that you haven't been seeing this? But the police have been in the news a little bit lately. Couple little stories that popped up. But one thing that's happening in a lot of schools, and this is happening more and more, is that schools are putting police officers into schools. And so one of the effects of that is that you'll see police officers who will be acting as police officers. And what do police officers do? Well, they, use their policing authority. And one of those things is using things like arrest or the threat of arrest on students. And you end up in situations where, in this case, we have a police officer arresting an 8-year-old. I wish I could say that this image is of the one time that happened, but it happens a bunch. And not only does it happen to 8-year-olds, but when you get cops in high schools and so on, you get situations where kids kids get into fights, or kids are misbehaving in one way or another, or they're perceived to be misbehaving. And instead of having their parents called, or them getting suspended, or them getting, talked to by a teacher or a counselor or something, they get arrested. And that's a pretty serious problem, because then those kids end up with records. They might get kicked out of school. And then you end up with people who can't get jobs, people who end up having serious issues with the school system itself, and not trusting authority figures, and lots of bad things happen as a result. And so, so there's definitely very dysfunctional things that can take place. And then this is something that pisses me off to no end. I mean, all these things do, but you can also have schools that are just teaching the wrong stuff, right? So this is actually much less. This is much more common than we realize. If you go back through what you were taught from, preschool all the way through college, and if somehow we could sit down and we could just look at every lesson you've ever learned, a lot of the stuff that you have been explicitly taught, not that you've picked up places, but that teachers have explicitly taught you, is incorrect, right? So, for instance, a lot of people go through school at some point being told that blood is blue, right? That's a thing that gets told to people a lot. Happened to my kid, happens in all kinds of places. It's a silly little example, but blood is not blue. It isn't, never is. It's not a thing that is real, but teachers will teach that to kids, and those kids will believe that forever, and it's wrong. Now, that's pretty silly, but there's also things like, discussions about history, right? Oftentimes either leave out super important things, or explicitly take events and then twist them and turn them into something that they're not. So this actually just occurs to me. I wasn't thinking about this when I wrote the lecture, but there's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. It's a bit older now, but it's really great. So it's like 13 chapters, and each chapter goes over common things that kids are taught from elementary school to high school that are just wrong. They're just incorrect. But these things enter our heads. We believe that they're correct, and that has implications, right? So it has implications for the way we see our countries, the way we see ourselves, the way we see our societies. There's a lot that can matter there. What I put up on the screen is, this makes me so mad. So luckily, this doesn't happen anymore. I don't think, at least, I hope this doesn't happen anymore. But I don't want to call it a controversy, because it's not a controversy, but there are people out there who reject evolution as something that they reject the idea that we should be teaching evolution to kids. Instead, they want to teach what's called intelligent design or creationism. They're the same exact thing, which is an argument that in order for life to have gotten to the level of complexity that it is, like human beings or animals, whatever, that would mean that our development would have to be guided by a creator, an intelligent designer. It's basically like God did it, right? It's saying God created the universe and us and all that. I mean, that's what it is. It's what the perspective is. That's what it's arguing. And so creationists, intelligent designers have been able to worm their way into or onto things like school boards, school committees, things like that. And they have been able to kind of like inject themselves into classrooms, right? So you have teachers talking about things like intelligent design or criticizing evolution, which they should be doing anyway, but criticizing evolution from the perspective of religion, which is a serious problem. And so what I have up here, this was literally on a sticker that was stuck inside, I think it was biology textbooks, saying this textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact regarding the origin of living things. Actually, it's not regarding the origin of living things, so that's already wrong. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. There's so much wrong with that. First, like, there's a lot of problems with this. For instance, we'd have to get into all kinds of stuff about, what counts as a fact versus what's a theory and so on. But the goal of this kind of sticker, this kind of message, is to explicitly, it's very clearly to get kids to start thinking in terms of creationism, getting kids to think like, natural processes couldn't have led to humanity. It's got to be a deity. There's just a lot to unpack with this, and I really want to. It would take a long time though, so I'm just going to move on from it, even though it's infuriating. If you want to talk to me about it, I will for a long time, and I'll unpack all this stuff for you because it pisses me off. But so schools often will teach incorrect things, and something like this really matters too, because if we want to have scientifically literate kids, we want engineers and scientists. They can't be learning this stuff. It's not good. So there's talk about these different kinds of functions. So manifest, latent functions, and dysfunctions. I want to transition now to talking about deviance, right, from a functionalist perspective. This is where it gets a little weird, okay? But from a functionalist perspective, if something exists in society, especially if it's something that exists across all societies throughout all time, the argument's going to be that phenomenon must be functional in one way or another. It's going to be doing something for those societies or for society in general. And so since we always see deviance there in any type of social group, in any type of culture, there's always deviance in one way or another. There's always some way of saying, right, like this person did something wrong. These people did things the right way. There's never going to be any sort of society or even small scale social group where there's no violations of norms at all. So the argument that comes out of functionalism is that deviance itself, so the violation of social norms and rules itself, has to be functional. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. I mean, deviance itself is not like an official social institution, but it always exists. And so since no society is free of deviance must be fundamental to the survival, gotta breathe. All right. So deviance must be fundamental to the survival of societies in one way or another. Deviance must be doing something. A lot of this comes out of Durkheim's arguments, which we've talked about. We've talked about how punishment, when people are committing an act of deviance, punishment becomes this collective action that reaffirms social solidarity, reminds people the rules, and something that we haven't really talked about, but when people deviate, where people break social rules, that can actually facilitate social change too, which I'm not going to really get into because it's not quite as relevant to the stuff we're talking about, but there is that function of deviance as well. These other two, though, reaffirming social solidarity and reminding people the rules, reinforcing the rules, those are things that popped up in other videos, so you can go back and check those out. Because they're obviously amazing, right? I'm sure you loved just soaking them in. Just wonderful. But I already talked about all that stuff, so I'm not gonna really get into it again. What I do want to do, though, is talk about this article by this guy Herb Gans called "The Uses of Poverty." So we can think about poverty as a form of deviance, which is kind of an odd thing to do, but we do think about poverty or people living in poverty as different or as not the norm, and so there are often reactions to or sanctions against people who are poor, either getting people look down on them or insult them, or lower life expectancy. All kinds of things. And so Herb Gans, this definitely functionalist, wrote this piece where he argues that poverty is functional. That poverty, the existence of poverty, and the existence of people who are living in poverty is functional in the sense that having people who are poor strengthens society as a whole. In other words, the poor have functions. And in this article, he lists something like 13 of them, I think it is. And he splits them between economic and social functions. I'm going to give 8. I'm not going to go through all of them. So there's the economic functions of the poor. I'm going to give 4 of these. These are all direct quotes from the article, so just be aware that these are quotes. So first, the existence of poverty ensures that society's dirty work will be done. What do we mean by dirty work? Well, we need people to clean toilets. We need people to do back-breaking construction that we don't want to do. We need people to work in animal meat processing facilities, dangerous jobs that I don't want to do. So if we didn't have poverty, if we didn't have people who were desperate, if we didn't have people who are willing to do whatever we need them to do, if we didn't have people who had no other options, then no one would ever decide to clean toilets, right? But we need a class of people that are desperate enough to go work in meat packing facilities that are really dangerous, or to clean our toilets, which is gross. We need people who are willing to do that, and people just aren't going to just want to do it, right? Like, we need people who are desperate, who have no other options, right? So the poor provide, fill that role. Because the poor are required to work at low wages, they subsidize a variety of economic activities that benefit the affluent. So the existence of the poor allows wealthier people to live better lives. Now, I'm guessing that when you read this, when you hear this, you probably are thinking of like really wealthy people, and you're like, oh, those rich people, and they're taking advantage of the poor. They're awful, and we should not have that. Stupid Jeff Bezos or whoever. But I'm gonna point out to you that the poor subsidize your activities. If you are watching this right now, you are benefiting from the exploitation and the desperation and the low wage labor of the poor. Because take a look at the clothes that you're wearing, probably made by exploited children, and then the fact that you had people working in factories with really bad working conditions, overseas. They may be kids, or whatever. Might be working in factories that are very polluting because that's cheaper, and that ends up causing health problems for the people in the area, and so on. The computer that you're watching this on, or the cell phone that you're watching this on, that's generated by low wage labor, performed by the poor all over the world. So in this instance, you're the affluent person and you're benefiting from the labor of the poor. Okay. And that's it's just true. Like, you wouldn't have your iPhone if there weren't people living in poverty all over the world doing things like the mining and the collection of um, toxic components and the recycling parts, which is incredibly dangerous. And again, I won't get into it, but there's a lot of stuff that is very dangerous and very polluting and very damaging to people's health and lives, that we benefit directly from because they let us have things like inexpensive clothing, inexpensive food, the technology that we depend on, and so on. If you take away poverty from the world, those things either go away entirely or they become much, much, much more expensive. Poverty creates jobs for a number of occupations and professions that serve or service the poor or protect the rest of society from them. So the existence of the poor provides jobs for people like social workers, provides jobs for people like prison guards and prison administrators, for police, for doctors who want to get something to put on their resumes, so when they can go volunteer somewhere in a poor area, get some experience before they go off to their like real jobs, which sounds awful, but this is really stuff that happens. And so that they can feel good about themselves and they can sell themselves later on as like, hey, I did this nice thing and I got this training and I made all my early mistakes on these poor people over here, so I am ready to get hired by you. So it's very dark. It's a very dark thing. But yeah, poverty creates jobs for people who aren't poor, right? It's basically what this is saying. And the poor buy goods that others do not want, and thus prolong the economic usefulness of such goods. What happens to like clothes that no one else wants to buy, or what happens to food that's not great or that's old? Well, poor people buy that stuff, and so that provides a stronger stream of income for people who are selling things. Right? They can take the stuff that isn't well made, like the stuff with defects, the stuff that's old, the stuff that other people don't want, and they have a market for them. Poor people. There are also social functions of the poor. And again, these are all direct quotes from Gans. So the poor can be identified and punished as alleged or real deviants in order to uphold the legitimacy of conventional norms. So one of the things that we've talked about in the context of Durkheim and right now is the fact that deviance can serve to reinforce social norms, social order, because when people violate rules, we punish them, and that has held up an example of like, don't be like that person that we're punishing, right? Well, the poor are an easy target, so we can reinforce and reaffirm social norms by targeting the poor, regardless of whether or not they've done anything wrong, in order to demonstrate or serve as a teaching tool to the non-poor. Say, hey, like, don't act like this, right? So, like that 8-year-old kid who's getting arrested in some school somewhere, we could say, hey, don't do what that kid did because you don't want to get arrested. That kid, I'm guessing, wasn't wealthy. So the poor become an easy target for us to, punish and then say, oh, okay, well, don't be like that person, right? They become a teaching tool for others. The poor serve a direct cultural function when culture created by or for them is adopted by the more affluent. So here we're talking about cultural appropriation, right? So for instance, either country music or the blues or folk music or rap or hip hop, right? These forms of culture or these cultural creations that formed what were originally among groups that were economically disadvantaged, but that get developed and produced by people, in situations of economic disadvantage, but then bubble up and become things that are consumed by the wealthy, right? Wealthier folks. So the upper class folks benefit from the culture that's created by the disadvantaged. Poverty helps to guarantee the status of those who are not poor. So if you are, maybe you're not rich, but you can say, hey, I'm not rich, but at least I'm not like that guy. If you are not poor, if things aren't going well, the poor give you a way to feel good about yourself, right? Because you're not them, right? And the poor, being powerless, can be made to absorb the costs of change and growth in American society. So, for instance, yeah, we want to have, factories producing, we want to have factories producing stuff in the US, right? Because we want to buy American, maybe. Well, where are you going to put that factory? Well, let's put it, you're not going to put it in a wealthy area where people are going to be like breathing in the fumes and dealing with the pollution. No, you put it in a poor area where you end up with a bunch of poor kids who have asthma. Somebody's going to absorb the cost of living near that factory. It ends up being the poor people. Well, what about when we need to? I don't know. God, it's if we're going to pollute an area, it's not going to be where rich people live. Well, what if through the course of economic development, we need more and more people to do more and more of that dirty work? Well, we need people to absorb that, so it ends up being the poor. So whenever there's any costs that the economy creates or that our culture creates or whatever, uh, regardless of who is benefiting, the poor tend to be the people who are suffering because of that growth and development. One example is like medical research, right? So when doctors are developing drugs or pharmaceutical companies are testing out mental health treatments or vaccines or whatever, you need people to experiment on. And one of the ways that you can recruit people, and one of the ways that people do get recruited, is through the use of financial incentives. So you might offer people a couple $100 to participate in a clinical trial for a drug to treat depression. Well, it's a new drug. You don't know if it's safe or not. Wealthy people already have options. They already have access to money. They have access to other forms of treatment. So they're probably not going to be the ones volunteering for those medical research studies. Who ends up there? People who don't have access to healthcare in other ways, and people who need money. Tends to be the poor. So when there are bad side effects, when there are unexpected complications that come from the research process, who bears those costs? Well, it's poor people. Who benefits in the long term from that research? Wealthier people, right? Because they're the ones who are going to get those drugs later on. And they get the ones that are safe, because the ones that aren't safe, we found out that they're not safe because poor people got the side effects, right? And they are the ones who suffer the harm. So they absorb the costs of things. Quick reminder, this is super important. When we are talking about things like poverty or deviance being functional, we're not saying that they're good for individuals. We're not saying that any of this stuff about poverty is good for individuals, right? We're not saying it's good that people have to do dirty work. It's good that people in poverty subsidize economic activities of the more well off. None of this is good, but it is functional in the sense that the existence of the poor does these things that help to maintain society over time. Okay. Again, we can just split out that moral component versus what's considered functional. All right. Just like, the way we use the word deviance shouldn't imply bad or wrong. Right. It just, I don't know. It's functionalism can just be depressing. But so the end. I hope you have a good day after this upbeat and uplifting lecture. Bye.